This is my review of the book The Buddha Pill: Can Mindfulness Change You? By Dr. Miguel Farias and Dr. Wikholm. It's a book that brings together a lot of history of how meditation, yoga, and mindfulness entered Western discourse as a tool for physical and psychological health benefits, mixing in a lot of rich personal experience from the authors themselves and conversations they've had with others. But most importantly, and in being the main focus of the book, analysis on scientific research findings. The book has made a lot of contributions to science in this area, bringing to light many of the issues surrounding mindfulness research. By current standards, it's certainly not alone in these criticisms. For example, in 2017, a paper published in Perspectives of Psychological Science delivered the consensus of 15 researchers in mindfulness research, which also pointed out the problems within mindfulness research and urged a greater need to think critically and nuanced about the research and what it actually says, rather than buying into hype. As pointed out in the book, it's because of this hype that research has been shaky, with both experimenters and participants eager to see big, positive results. As I'm sure you can imagine, the book covers a lot, but there are two main issues I'd like to discuss, which are covered in chapters 5 and 6 in the book. These are control groups and the potential harms that has often been overlooked by mindfulness research. I've chosen these two issues because I think they're the most wide-reaching and relevant for everyone to know about, since they also help us answer the question, can mindfulness be helpful for you? There are also claims that we can check against the current research in 2025, 10 years after the book's first publication in 2015, to see if they hold true today. Firstly, in control groups. One of the standard practices in clinical research is to use both an experimental group, where you give, for example, a therapy, and a control group, which is a comparable activity without the actual therapy elements. This allows you to see the difference between doing and not doing the therapy. But after initial assessments where waiting lists are acceptable as a control, it's important that the control group to be an comparable activity. Otherwise, you don't know if the effects seen are from undergoing therapy or merely a placebo effect from participating in the study or doing just some kind of activity in general. In other words, you need an active control group. The issue with mindfulness research, as identified in the book, is it can be difficult to create and use the right control group activity to be comparable to that of meditation. So a lot of studies have lacked these, using a passive control group where they continue activities as normal. In the book, it's reported on two meta-analyses. These are basically studies that group together lots of data from other studies to make one big conclusion. From these two meta-analyses, the one in 2012 looked at 163 studies and found that 10 were using an active control group. And in 2014, the study found that mindfulness practice produced no better benefits compared to using simple relaxation or exercise, which can be thought of as some kind of an active control group, but one that still is imperfect. The question we can ask is, what does current research have to say about this? Simon Goldberg, in collaboration with many other researchers, has published 2 reviews after the book came out that help us look at this. In 2017, they found that research methodologies between 2000 and 2016, there had been no significant improvements in using active controls compared to passive ones, directly supporting the idea that use of passive controls is an issue. More recently, in 2021, they looked at 44 meta-analyses compared to the 2 that are looked at in the book, finding the same effect described in the book for active versus passive controls. When active controls were used, there seemed to be a much smaller difference between the experimental and control groups compared to the differences which can be seen when passive control groups are used. This suggests that mindfulness may not be producing benefits as big as reported in research when they are practiced in real life. I couldn't find any reviews or meta-analyses as rigorous as these in recent years, but went through some of the studies myself, which explores using randomized controlled trials and mindfulness-based interventions. And passive control groups seem to very much still be an issue in recent research, with some attempts to balance them out, but ones that still use passive control groups instead of active ones. For examples of these, van der Heide in 2024 in BMC Neurology and Zhao 2025 in BMC Psychologies both use passive controls where participants continued their usual medical treatments, but tried to balance out the attention paid to both the experimental and control groups. The issue is that still this uses passive control groups, which, given the previous findings, may be producing shaky and exaggerated results, which may not have been as strong as active control groups were used. Safe to say that passive control groups are still an issue in mindfulness research that is in dire need of attention. And while they may be difficult to implement, active control groups are possible to use, which is identified in the book. For this reason, the Buddha pill still holds a lot of relevance today in this area, even if data is somewhat limited in the book. The next point I want to talk about is the harms of mindfulness. In the book, the authors discuss a lot of the context where meditation comes from, to illustrate that it wasn't really designed as a tool for well-being the way that is being used in Western discourse, but it was originally used for the dissolution of one's ego to enable some kind of self-discovery, which has also often been used for violent means, including by Japanese samurais, Nazi Germany leadership, and current political militant movements in India. In terms of evidence, there was limited studies available at the time of the book being published, and this was true even more recently as of 2019, with Ruth Baer and others in Clinical Psychology Review reporting that the literature on harms was so small that it wasn't able to conduct a systematic review on harms and their prevalence in mindfulness. The book was discussing a handful of case studies, older papers, and one yet-to-be-published study by Willoughby Britton, and these showed that mindfulness could lead to distressing outcomes, and if not addressed, could lead to serious problems. Given when the book was published, the research was quite limited. I think I'd like to go through some of this research and sort of illustrate our modern understanding of the issue. In 2020, Ruth Baer and others concluded that unpleasant experiences were common, around affecting 2/3 of participants, but actual long-term lasting effects were very low and mild. And in 2021, Willoughby Britton and others published a similar paper, finding that around 60% reported at least one type of harm. But also, additionally, 40% reported harms that occurred outside of the actual therapy session, which is similar to the kind of rates that we see in other psychological therapies, suggesting that there isn't a huge amount of concern around these, but ones that still should be paid towards them. In terms of the types of harms experienced, these were most commonly hyperarousal, relating to anxiety and insomnia, and dissociation. So all of the findings I've discussed just now align with the argument of the book, that given mindfulness's origins for ego dissolution, some level of distress is expected in order to lead to some kind of change in a person. But something that is totally missed in the book is the negative outcomes that can be more complex. For example, Guo et al. In 2023 found that doing mindfulness with high intelligence individuals may reduce prosocial behavior. And this is something that isn't to do with the origins of mindfulness, and so it's missed in the book's analysis. Now, I know I've been very negative about mindfulness in this review. Given the book itself aims to be very critical of the research that was available, I think it's important to remember that mindfulness can be helpful. And the thing to implement is to ground your expectations and be realistic when it comes to mindfulness. That's part of the reason why I think this book is worth reading. It's about looking past the excitement of mindfulness to remind you that mindfulness can be good for you and can lead to personal change if used effectively in the right way. If you're starting to think at the end of this review that you're doubtful about meditation and whether it's worth your time at all, I wouldn't encourage you to think so. The researchers that wrote this book, as well as the articles I've all talked about, at the end of the day, are written by mindfulness researchers. They've dedicated their careers to furthering research in this area. To be critical about this issue, not to say that mindfulness is bad, but because if we want to understand mindfulness, both its benefits and its drawbacks, just as the same way that all medicines can have benefits and side effects, we need to use a proper, good research standard in order to understand them. From an academic standpoint, a lot of future research directions can and have been drawn from the book, including the need to look at harms, and as I've discussed, some of the criticisms that it makes of research, including control groups, still hold true a decade later. I definitely think this book is worth a read.